Imagine for a second, right, that
Yes.
you are you're strapped into the cavernous, vibrating belly of a CH-47 Chinook helicopter.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a vivid image.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, the rotors are just screaming. The cabin smells super heavily of aviation fuel and, copper.
Mhm.
And right in front, literally right in front of you, a team of trauma surgeons is performing open chest surgery
Mid-flight.
mid-flight, somewhere over an active combat zone. I mean, it is this absolute miracle of modern logistics and medical science.
Yeah, it's essentially a flying intensive care unit.
Exactly. Just designed to snatch a soldier back from the absolute brink of death.
It really is an incredible image, and
Yeah.
it represents the absolute pinnacle of what we call multinational combat care, because the amount of coordination required just to put that helicopter in the air is, oh, it's staggering.
It's wild. But now I want you to hold that image, right, and
Mhm.
contrast it with something entirely different. So picture a concrete building in a bustling, dusty city, and painted on the roof of that building is a massive, just unmistakable red cross.
Right, the universal symbol.
Exactly. For over a century under the Geneva Conventions, that symbol meant one thing. It meant sanctuary. Like, do not shoot, do not bomb. We are just healing the wounded here.
A universally recognized safe haven. Or, well, I guess at least it used to be.
Yeah, and that's the terrifying reality we are diving into today. Because what the data now tells us is that the Red Cross on that roof, it is no longer a shield.
Not at all.
In a lot of modern conflicts, it has effectively become a targeting reticle,
Yeah.
a bullseye.
Yeah. And the contrast between those two scenarios, I mean, the high-tech, highly protected military medevac, and then the civilian hospital being systematically dismantled from the air, that is sort of the messy, contradictory heart of global humanitarian medicine today.
Absolutely. So welcome to today's deep dive. If you're a longtime listener, you know the drill. And if you're new here, well, here is our promise to you.
We basically take a massive, intimidating stack of source material, right?
Yeah, exactly. Things you probably do not have time to read on a Tuesday afternoon. And we distill it down into the most crucial, mind-expanding insights. We really want you to walk away from this conversation seeing the world, and specifically the news you consume, through an entirely new lens.
And the stack of material we're synthesizing today is incredibly heavy. I mean, both literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
We're pulling from a really diverse array of perspectives. So we have the ALNEP State of the Humanitarian System Inception Report from 2021.
Which is dense.
Oh, incredibly dense. It's essentially a massive, intricate blueprint trying to figure out how to, grade the entire multi-billion-dollar global aid apparatus.
Right. And we're pairing that massive bureaucratic document with two incredibly raw, really powerful commentaries published in The Lancet in 2017.
Yeah, those pieces they're intense.
They really are. They tear away the polite veneer of humanitarian medicine. They expose the deliberate targeting of hospitals and, the deep, unsettling ethical dilemmas of conducting research on disaster survivors.
Which is a whole other minefield. And then, to understand the military side of the equation, we're weaving in a foundational piece from the RUSI Journal,
Oh, that one.
written by former UK Surgeon General. And it frankly, it blew my mind regarding how military strategy and public relations actively dictate medical care on the battlefield.
So the goal here is synthesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
We are going to connect those boardroom methodologies with the actual frontline realities.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the core mission of this deep dive.
Yeah.
We are here to completely shatter the illusion that humanitarian aid is just this, neutral, benevolent act.
Right, like the classic image of just handing out blankets and bandages in a political vacuum.
Yeah, that's not how it works. We want to show you how saving a life in a conflict zone is inherently political. It's deeply chaotic, and it's part of an ever-evolving ecosystem. So let's go back to that painted cross on the roof.
Okay.
Before we can even talk about how the global community tries to fix or, measure the humanitarian system, we have to look at the visceral reality on the ground.
Which is the literal destruction of the safe haven.
Exactly.
The Lancet commentaries, they do an exceptional job of pulling no punches on this topic. They track a very clear, very disturbing trend across conflict zones like Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Yemen.
And historically, attacking a hospital was considered a war crime, right?
Absolutely. It was a line that even the most ruthless combatants hesitated to cross because of the massive international blowback.
But now,
Hospitals and healthcare workers are increasingly becoming primary active targets.
and we aren't just talking about rogue militias here, are we? We are talking about state actors. highly organized coalitions. I mean, look at Medicine Sans Frontières, MSF, or Doctors Without Borders.
Right, the absolute gold standard for neutral medical aid.
Yeah, they go where literally nobody else will go.
Yeah.
And the Lancet piece explicitly highlights how their identity has been, well, fundamentally scarred by this new era of warfare.
It really has.
They detail an incident in August 2016 in Yemen, a brutal, direct attack on an MSF-supported facility. And the really chilling part, that was their 5th deadly attack on an MSF-supported medical service in Yemen alone.
In a single conflict.
In a single conflict.
I mean, the psychological toll that takes on an organization built on the premise of neutrality is just profound. But what makes this trend even more infuriating, honestly, is the international diplomatic context surrounding it.
Oh, the bureaucracy of it all.
Exactly. Let's look at the timeline. So that deadly MSF attack in Yemen happened in August 2016. Just 3 months prior to that, in May 2016, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 2286.
Okay, so let me guess the bureaucratic cycle here.
Yeah.
The international community sees hospitals getting bombed, they get outraged, they draft a massive piece of paper, everyone in suits claps the UN headquarters, and then nothing.
Nothing changes.
Yeah, pretty much nothing changes. Because from the sources, it seems like Resolution 2286 wasn't just a minor memo. It was co-sponsored by over 80 member states. I mean, that is a massive display of international consensus.
Oh, it was heralded as a landmark moment. Resolution 2286 strongly, unequivocally condemned attacks and threats against the wounded, healthcare workers, and medical facilities. It demanded an end to impunity.
Right.
It deplored the long-term consequences of these attacks on civilian populations. It was supposed to be the line in the sand, you know. But as the Lancet authors sharply point out, by the time the one-year anniversary of that resolution rolled around, there had been no serious commitment to its implementation.
Wait, none.
None.
So the UN Secretary General provides recommendations, and the Security Council doesn't even bother to debate implementing them.
The diplomatic momentum just completely stalled. The attacks simply continued, unabated, in Syria, in Yemen, basically across the globe.
Man, if you're a healthcare worker on the ground, that has to be the ultimate betrayal.
Absolutely.
It feels like watching the referee in a soccer match blow the whistle for a flagrant, dangerous foul, walk up to the offending player, and then just refuse to hand out a red card or even a yellow card.
Right. They just blow the whistle and say, please stop.
Exactly. Please don't do that. The players on the field are immediately going to realize that the rules don't actually matter. There is no real consequence.
That analogy captures the frustration perfectly. And the perpetrators of these attacks, they actively rely on that exact lack of consequence.
Yeah.
The authors in The Lancet warn about a specific, insidious tactic used by state militaries and armed groups. It's the weaponization of plausible deniability. Because there is no transparent, independent verification mechanism actually enforced by the UN, individual attacks on hospitals are far too easily brushed off.
Right, they use the standard PR playbook. They call it collateral damage, or they claim the hospital was, like, secretly housing insurgents, or they just chalk it up to a tragic targeting error in the heat of battle.
The fog of war.
The fog of war, exactly.
That phrase is used constantly to shield perpetrators from accountability. I mean, we saw similar language deployed by the Pentagon following the devastating AC-130 gunship attack on the MSF Trauma Center in Kunduz, Afghanistan, back in 2015.
Wow, yeah.
When the international community accepts these excuses without demanding rigorous independent verification, it essentially provides a permission structure.
Right.
It allows combatants to systematically dismantle a region's healthcare infrastructure without ever facing a war crimes tribunal.
Which totally explains why the humanitarian sector is having to become its own intelligence agency.
Yes, exactly.
The sources mention the monitoring violence against healthcare tool implemented in Syria.
Right.
The fact that doctors and NGO workers have to build real-time data tracking systems just to prove to the world that they are actively being bombed. I mean, that is a staggering indictment of modern warfare.
It really is.
But this leads to a deeper philosophical point in the Lancet commentary that really stopped me in my tracks. They argue that humanitarian medicine isn't just a technical exercise.
No, not at all.
It's not just about logistics, securing supply chains, and executing surgical techniques.
It goes so much deeper than the clinical act of healing. The authors propose that humanitarian action, by its very nature, is a form of rebellion.
A rebellion.
Yes. It inevitably involves fighting the established political and military order that is responsible for creating the crisis in the first place.
And the quote they use to justify that is, Well, it's heavy. They say humanitarianism fundamentally rejects the logic that divides humanity into those who may live and those who must die.
It's a powerful statement. Think about it. When a military force decides to besiege a city, their strategic logic dictates that the population inside must suffer to force a surrender.
Right.
They are deciding that those people must die, or at least be brought to the absolute brink of death. So when a doctor sneaks medical supplies across that siege line to treat a wounded civilian, they are actively subverting that military strategy.
They are rebelling.
Exactly. They are rebelling against the combatant's sovereign claim over life and death. Therefore, to the combatant, the doctor is no longer neutral. The doctor is a direct threat to the strategic objective.
Those who may live and those who must die. If you're listening right now, just sit with that phrase for a second. It completely reorients how you view a medical tent in a war zone.
It really changes the entire paradigm.
But I have to push back on this, or at least ask the incredibly dark question that this brings up.
Okay, go for it.
If the logic of modern war inherently views healing as an act of rebellion, and if the highest international bodies like the UN Security Council cannot or will not enforce the protection of hospitals, I mean, isn't the concept of neutral medical space essentially dead?
That is the big question.
Have we just lost that idea entirely? And NGOs just need to accept they are participants in the conflict.
It is the most existential debate happening within organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross right now.
I can imagine.
I wouldn't go so far as to say the concept is entirely dead, but it is undoubtedly facing the most severe threat since the inception of the Geneva Conventions.
So what has actually changed on the ground?
What has changed is the burden of proof. It used to be that the Red Cross emblem granted you automatic immunity. Now the emblem means very little on its own.
Wow.
Humanitarian organizations have to constantly, exhaustively negotiate access with local warlords, state militaries, and rebel factions.
They have to prove they aren't a threat.
Every single day, they have to actively build community acceptance, proving daily that they are not spies or political actors. And sometimes, tragically, despite all that effort, they just have to pack up and withdraw because the risk to their surgeons and nurses is simply too high.
Because they can't guarantee safety.
Right. The safe haven isn't a given right anymore. It is a temporary, fragile bubble that must be aggressively negotiated and defended every single day.
So we have a clear picture of civilian humanitarian organizations like MSF struggling just to survive the crossfire. But that makes me wonder about the other side of the coin.
The military side.
Yeah. How do state militaries, the ones heavily armed, incredibly well-funded, and actively participating in the combat, how do they handle the medical care of their own troops?
It's a completely different world.
And how does the reality of young soldiers coming home in flag-draped coffins impact the very wars those militaries are trying to fight?
To understand that, we turn to our second major source. This is the RUSI Journal article by Louis Lillywhite.
Right.
As a former Surgeon General of the UK Defence Medical Services, he offers an incredibly clinical, almost detached, but deeply fascinating look at the intersection of public perception, casualty rates, and military medical strategy.
The casualty figures he presents really shattered my assumptions. I mean, if you ask the average person on the street today, they tend to think of the recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan as these massive, high-casualty meat grinders for Western forces.
And look, the loss of any life is a tragedy, and those conflicts have left deep scars.
Of course.
But from a purely historical, statistical standpoint, the numbers tell a very different story about what the public is actually willing to accept.
What were the numbers he looked at?
Well, Lillywhite notes that at the time he was writing this in 2009, there had been 182 combat deaths in Afghanistan and 136 in Iraq for UK forces.
Okay, so that's a combined total of 318 deaths over several years of intense combat.
Right, 318 deaths. But then he juxtaposes that with historical conflicts. He looks at the Falklands War in 1982. In just a 6-week period, the UK sustained 255 combat deaths.
In 6 weeks.
Yes, or look closer to home, Northern Ireland. In a single year, 1972, there were 146 uniformed military deaths.
Wow.
That is 10 more deaths in 1 year in Northern Ireland than the entirety of the UK's Iraq campaign up to 2009.
I mean, the sheer volume of death that previous generations of the public tolerated is astonishing by modern standards.
It really is. And this brings Lillywhite to a crucial analysis of human psychology and political science. How does a domestic population react to these numbers?
Right.
He references a compelling framework suggesting that Public tolerance for military casualties isn't a flat line. It doesn't just slowly erode over time.
Okay.
It is actually triphasic. It moves through three distinct psychological stages.
Okay, let's unpack this triphasic model
Yeah.
because it explains so much about how politicians talk about war. I'll guess phase one.
Go for it.
Phase one has to be initial acceptance, right? The troops deploy, the flags are waving, there's a surge of patriotism.
Exactly.
The public accepts the initial casualties because the decision to go to war is fresh, popular, and the numbers are still perceived as relatively low. The classic rally around the flag effect.
You've hit it exactly. Phase one is driven by the initial justification for the conflict. If the casus belli is strong, like responding to a direct attack, the public gives the military a wide berth.
Makes sense.
But as the conflict drags on, the psychological calculus shifts, bringing us to phase two.
And phase two is where it gets psychologically grim, right? It's tolerance, but a trapped kind of tolerance.
It is entirely retrospective. In phase two, the public continues to accept new casualties, not necessarily because they still believe fervently in the original mission.
Why?
Because they feel that to pull out now would mean the lives already lost were given in vain.
Oh, wow.
They cannot bear the thought that the previous 100 soldiers died for nothing, so they tolerate the next 10 dying to validate the sacrifice.
It is the sunk cost fallacy, but applied to human life instead of a bad financial investment.
Exactly.
That is incredibly dark, but when you look at the rhetoric surrounding prolonged conflicts, we must honor the fallen by finishing the job. It is incredibly real.
It's a powerful political trap, but it eventually breaks, leading to phase three, rejection.
Okay, and what triggers rejection?
This tipping point occurs when the public collectively decides, despite the sunk costs, that the war is fundamentally unwinnable, or that the strategic goals are no longer worth the blood being spilled.
At that moment, tolerance drops to zero.
Zero. Any further casualties are deemed politically and morally unacceptable, and you see massive popular movements demanding immediate withdrawal.
So put yourself in the shoes of a military commander or a surgeon general. You know this triphasic clock is ticking.
Constantly ticking.
You know that if casualty numbers climb too high, you will hit phase three, public support will evaporate, and you will lose the war politically, regardless of what is happening tactically on the ground.
Absolutely.
That means there is an overwhelming existential strategic imperative to keep casualty rates as low as humanly possible.
Yes. It's not just a moral duty to the soldiers. It is the absolute prerequisite for maintaining the campaign.
That pressure must be immense.
That intense pressure is the primary driver behind the absolutely incredible, almost science fiction level advances we've seen in military medicine over the last 2 decades.
What kind of advance?
Well, Lillywhite points out a staggering metric. Historically, the mortality rate for severely injured troops, meaning soldiers who sustained massive trauma but actually survived long enough to make it to a field medical facility, was hovering around 15 to 25%.
Which is terrifying.
It is.
You survive the IED, you survive the medevac flight, you get to the hospital tent, and you still have up to a 1 in 4 chance of dying.
But by 2009, due to massive systemic overhauls in how they practiced medicine in a war zone, they managed to drop that mortality rate for severely injured casualties to approximately 16%.
Wait, dropping the mortality rate by nearly 10% across an entire theater of war?
Yeah.
That isn't just an incremental improvement. How do you actually achieve that on the ground? It can't just be like better tourniquets.
It was a complete structural revolution. For a long time, military medicine relied heavily on generalists or reservists.
Okay.
The revolution came when militaries stopped relying solely on traditional military medical models and started directly injecting civilian academic culture into the war zone.
What does that mean in practice?
They began deploying highly trained, regular hospital clinicians, trauma consultants who spend their civilian lives running emergency rooms in major cities like London or Chicago.
So people dealing with stabbings and car crashes every single day.
Exactly. They took those world-class experts, put them in uniform, and dropped them directly into field hospitals in Helmand or Kandahar.
Okay, but setting up an incredibly advanced, consultant-led field hospital that mimics a top-tier civilian trauma center. I mean, that requires a massive, almost incomprehensible amount of resources, equipment, and highly specialized staff.
It does. And that logistical reality leads to the next major shift Lillywhite outlines.
Which is?
The move away from purely national medical care to what he calls multinational combat care.
Because no matter how big your defense budget is, you cannot afford to put a state-of-the-art trauma center on every single forward operating base.
Precisely. Modern conflicts are fought by massive coalitions. You might have 40 different nations contributing troops to a mission like ISAF in Afghanistan. But a country might only send 300 soldiers. They cannot mathematically justify, nor do they have the capability to deploy a full hospital for 300 personnel.
So what do?
You end up with highly interspersed multinational forces relying on a few massive shared medical hubs. For example, the Roll 3 hospital in Kandahar was a combined effort heavily reliant on Canadian, Dutch, and UK medical personnel treating soldiers from dozens of different nations.
Which sounds like a beautiful display of international cooperation on paper. But practically, logistically, diplomatically, it sounds like an absolute nightmare.
Oh, it is.
You've got doctors from one country trained under specific national medical guidelines, operating under specific legal frameworks, injecting drugs into soldiers from a completely different country.
Yeah.
The friction there must be immense.
The friction is constant. And the RUSI article highlights a very specific, highly granular incident from 2007 that illustrates just how delicate this multinational web is.
What happened?
It was a blood failure incident involving the UK and the US.
A blood failure incident. What exactly went wrong?
Well, in the chaos of combat, UK troops who had suffered severe trauma were treated at a US medical facility.
Okay.
To save their lives, they were given emergency blood transfusions. However, it was later discovered that the blood provided by the US facility had inadvertently not been subsequently tested for certain bloodborne diseases according to the specific, rigorous standards required by UK medical protocols.
Oh, wow. So the blood saved their lives in the moment. But now you have an entire cohort of soldiers who might have been exposed to something because of differing national testing standards.
Exactly. The fallout was massive.
I bet.
It wasn't a simple fix. The UK Defence Medical Services had to launch an exhaustive response. They had to involve the Civilian Health Protection Agency and the NHS National Blood and Transplant System.
And the U.S. side?
The U.S. military had to mobilize significant resources just to track down the specific personnel who donated the blood to check their records.
Oh, my goodness.
The diplomatic escalation reached the UK Embassy in Washington, requiring 3-star-level military liaison interventions. And because it's a democracy, the government had to brief political opposition spokesmen before the story leaked to the press.
All of that machinery, all of that diplomatic scrambling, because a single medical procedure in a chaotic coalition environment didn't perfectly align with a domestic regulation thousands of miles away.
Yes.
It shows how instantly a medical error can morph into a massive geopolitical and media crisis.
And it's crucial to note that Lily White isn't saying the U.S. care was suboptimal. In fact, the U.S. military leads the world in many combat care innovations.
Right, it's just different standards.
Exactly. The incident simply highlights the immense dangerous friction that occurs when differing national standards and legal expectations violently collide in a war zone.
And that friction isn't just about laboratory testing, is it? It dictates the very vehicles they use to pull you off the battlefield.
Oh, definitely.
I want to talk about the Black Hawk versus Chinook dilemma mentioned in the sources, because this absolutely blew my mind and feels like the darkest lottery imaginable.
This is perhaps the starkest example of differing national medical doctrines. So, the U.S. military, generally speaking, utilizes Black Hawk helicopters for their medical evacuation, their medevac missions.
Okay.
A Black Hawk is relatively small, it is highly maneuverable, and crucially, it is very fast to launch.
Right.
When a call comes in, a Black Hawk can be in the air and responding to a casualty incident incredibly quickly.
And in trauma medicine, the golden hour is everything. Speed is life. Get them off the dirt into a surgeon as fast as possible.
That is the U.S. doctrine, speed. But there is a physical trade-off.
Which is?
Because the Black Hawk is small, there is virtually no room inside the cabin. It severely limits the kind of medical interventions that the flight medic can perform mid-flight.
So they're essentially just keeping them alive and flying fast.
Stabilizing and flying fast, yes. The UK military approach, however, is fundamentally different. They utilize the CH-47 Chinook.
The Chinook is massive.
Yeah.
It's the one with the two huge rotors. Looks like a flying school bus.
Exactly. It is a massive, heavy-lift helicopter. Because of its size and complexity, it takes longer to spin up and launch than a Black Hawk.
Okay, so it's slower.
Yes. And furthermore, its massive silhouette presents a much larger target to enemy fire, which exposes a high-value medical team to significantly more risk while hovering over a hot landing zone.
So why use it? Why risk a slower, bigger target?
Because of what you can do inside that flying school bus.
Yeah.
The UK uses that massive cabin space to carry a consultant-led medical emergency response team.
Wow.
As Lily White bluntly describes it, the UK trauma team operating in the back of a Chinook can, in extremis, literally open a casualty's chest mid-flight, clamp an artery, and keep alive a soldier that would almost certainly bleed to death on the floor of a faster but smaller Black Hawk.
I need to make sure I'm understanding the implications of this.
Okay.
You have U.S. and U.K. forces fighting side by side in the same coalition. A roadside bomb goes off. Both a U.S. soldier and a U.K. soldier are critically injured. Are you telling me that their individual chance of surviving that blast might literally depend on the tail number and the nationality of the helicopter that the dispatcher happens to send to their grid coordinate?
Yes.
If you get the fast Black Hawk, you might bleed out before you reach the hospital.
Yeah.
If you get the slower Chinook, the surgeon can crack your chest open and save you.
It is a dark, absurd medical lottery. It is the stark, uncomfortable reality of multinational combat care. You are blending different philosophies of risk, speed, and capability over the exact same battlefield.
How on earth do military commanders or the politicians back home deal with the ethical and legal nightmare of that lottery?
It's incredibly difficult.
I mean, imagine a scenario where a UK soldier dies while being evacuated on a US Black Hawk.
Yeah.
And then a UK coroner conducts an inquest back in London and determines, based on the medical evidence, that the soldier would have survived if a UK Chinook with a surgical team had picked them up instead.
That's the exact nightmare scenario.
How does a government legally answer to a grieving family when the standard of care fluctuates based on helicopter availability?
It's an issue that keeps surgeon generals awake at night, and it is actively reshaping military law.
I can imagine.
The RUSI article explicitly notes how coroners' inquests in the UK have evolved. They are no longer simple fact-finding missions. They have become incredibly adversarial, functioning almost like a criminal court with the Ministry of Defense sitting in the chair of the accused.
Wow.
The families demand answers about the standard of care. So, to mitigate this legal and ethical exposure, militaries are being forced to establish incredibly complex systems of clinical governance across the entire coalition.
Clinical governance, what does that even mean in a war zone?
It essentially means rigorous, continuous quality assurance and auditing.
Okay.
Militaries can no longer just assume their allies are doing a good job. They're having to actively audit the medical competencies, the training standards, and the equipment of allied nations.
Diplomatically, that has to be a minefield. You are essentially sitting across the table from an allied general and saying, "We appreciate your contribution to the war effort, but we need to verify that we actually trust your doctors to treat our soldiers to our legal standards."
It is. The friction is unbelievable. They attempt to solve it through intense, months-long pre-deployment training exercises where multinational teams are forced to integrate.
Right.
They embed allied medical staff within their own hospital structures to ensure everyone is operating to a mutually agreed, highly scrutinized standard of care before they ever see a real casualty.
But even with all that prep.
Exactly. As you rightfully pointed out, the medical lottery of who picks you up in the dirt remains a persistent, irresolvable ethical tension in coalition warfare.
All right, so we've covered the absolute chaos of treating the wounded during the active fight, whether that's an NGO dodging airstrikes or a military auditing a coalition partner's blood supply.
Yeah, it's intense.
But conflicts eventually shift phases. What happens when the immediate trauma subsides? When a region is somewhat stabilized and the international community decides it is time to rebuild the health infrastructure.
That's where things get really complicated in a whole new way.
Because as we dig into the sources, a very cynical picture emerges.
Very.
The fight over how to rebuild a broken country's healthcare system seems to be driven way more by international geopolitics than by what the local population is actually begging for.
This transition brings us to a concept discussed in both the RUSI and Lancet sources known as the comprehensive approach.
Which sounds great on paper.
On the surface, it sounds incredibly holistic. But in practice, it means that health policy building clinics, vaccinating children, training nurses is actively weaponized as a tool of foreign policy.
Wow.
It is no longer just about healing sick people. It is about state building, stabilizing a volatile region, winning the proverbial hearts and minds of the populace, and ultimately achieving the geopolitical objectives of the donor nations.
If the goal is just to make the donor nations look good, I can see how that immediately disconnects from what a rural village actually needs.
Exactly.
Let's look at a concrete example of how this top-down approach goes horribly wrong. The RUSI article details a specific incident in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Walk us through what happened there between the local Afghan government and the international development donors.
It's a perfect, tragic case study in the massive disconnect between local, culturally specific needs and rigid international donor agendas.
Okay.
During the reconstruction efforts in Helmand Province, the Afghan Minister of Health looked at the specific needs of his population and repeatedly officially asked the international community, specifically the massive financial institutions like the World Bank, that were controlling the reconstruction budget, to fund and build a dedicated women's hospital.
Which, if you know anything about the cultural context of rural Afghanistan, seems like an incredibly reasonable, high-impact, and frankly, obvious request.
Absolutely. It is a deeply conservative society that strictly separates men and women in public spaces. In that context, many women simply will not or cannot seek medical care if they have to be treated by male doctors in a general facility.
So they just don't get care.
Right. Having a dedicated women's facility, staffed entirely by female clinicians, is the absolute prerequisite for half the population having access to secondary health care. It was a vital, culturally competent request.
So the World Bank has billions of dollars earmarked for rebuilding Afghanistan. The local Minister of Health says, please build this specific hospital so our women can get care. What did the World Bank do?
They flat out refused.
Wait, why? Did they not have the money?
Oh, it wasn't a lack of funds. The refusal was entirely driven by the World Bank's internal policy and ideological stance at the time.
Ideological stance.
Yes. Their overarching development philosophy dictated that primary care, meaning small, decentralized, basic rural clinics, was the absolute undeniable priority for developing nations.
Okay, primary care is important,
But they believed that funding secondary care, like large, specialized hospitals in provincial capitals, was an inefficient use of resources that catered only to urban populations.
So despite having millions of dollars available for Helmand, they refused to allocate a single cent to the one piece of infrastructure the Afghan ministry was explicitly begging for, because it didn't fit their pre-approved spreadsheet of what good development looks like.
Exactly.
That is infuriating. So what happened? Did the women of Helmand just not get a hospital because of a World Bank policy debate in Washington?
The Afghan Ministry of Health was placed in an impossible position. They had to completely bypass the massive multinational development funds that were supposed to be rebuilding their country.
And do what instead?
They had to go hat in hand and sign a specific contract with Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, to build and run the women's hospital.
Wait, MSF, the Emergency Medical NGO.
Yes.
The exact same organization we just talked about getting bombed because they operate on the absolute fringes of war zones.
The very same.
They had to step in to build permanent infrastructure because the World Bank wouldn't do it. And ironically, MSF's entire operational ethos is to maintain a very strict intentional distance from military and state-building efforts to preserve their neutrality.
The irony is profound. The local government had to rely on a fiercely independent emergency humanitarian NGO to build a permanent foundational piece of civic infrastructure because the official reconstruction funds were hopelessly tied up in ideological bureaucracy.
That is wild.
The development system failed so spectacularly that the emergency response system had to build the hospital.
I'm trying to think of an analogy for how backwards this is. It's like your house burning down to the foundation. The insurance company shows up with a massive checkbook, but they absolutely refuse to pay for a new roof because their internal policy says fire prevention is the priority.
That's spot on.
So instead of a roof, they insist on buying you 10,000 smoke detectors.
Yeah.
Sorry you were getting rained on, but primary prevention is our mandate. Why is there such a massive, stubborn disconnect between what locals on the ground are begging for and what international donors are willing to write checks for?
Because, as the Lancet commentary argues so persuasively, international politics completely warp the architecture of health funding. Aid is very rarely given purely based on an objective epidemiological assessment of human need.
So what is it based on?
It is inextricably tied to the strategic interests, the domestic political pressures, and the geopolitical anxieties of the donor country.
Okay, give me an example of how donor anxiety dictates the medical response.
Look at the catastrophic Ebola outbreak in West Africa that began in 2014.
Right. I remember that dominating the news cycle for months. It was a massive, unprecedented global response. Militaries were deployed, billions were spent.
Yeah.
Eventually.
The key word in your sentence is eventually. The Lancet authors assert a very uncomfortable truth about that timeline. The massive influx of resources, the deployment of the U.S. military logistics, the billions of dollars, that response was not triggered by the catastrophic, heartbreaking loss of thousands of African lives that had been happening for months.
Wait, it wasn't the death toll that mobilized the world, so what was the trigger?
Media-fueled panic in high-income countries.
Really?
The global response truly aggressively mobilized only after a single laboratory-confirmed case of Ebola reached Dallas, Texas.
One case in the United States triggered the global response that thousands of deaths in West Africa couldn't.
Yes. When the virus crossed the ocean, global health actors suddenly had immense political leverage to secure funding from Western governments.
Because it was suddenly a domestic threat.
Exactly. But they didn't secure that funding by appealing to humanitarian empathy. They did it by reframing the health crisis as a direct national security threat to the West.
Ah, I see.
High-income nations opened their checkbooks to fund strategies of containment, driven by their own domestic political need to show their citizens they were keeping the virus out, rather than a primary desire to heal the afflicted in West Africa.
So the dark lesson that the global humanitarian system learned from Ebola is, if you want serious funding for a crisis, you have to convince a rich, powerful country that the crisis is eventually coming for them.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it demonstrates just how incredibly vulnerable humanitarian aid is to the political whims of the global north.
Oh, so?
The sources highlight this fragility by pointing to specific budget decisions. For example, the Lancet commentary impartially reports on the Trump administration's proposed 28.7% cuts to USA and the State Department at the time.
Okay.
They also point to a highly controversial policy where the European Union explicitly diverted essential humanitarian funds away from traditional aid programs and channeled them into efforts to stem the flow of migration from Libya across the Mediterranean.
Meaning, the money isn't going to where people are suffering the most medically. It's going to projects that act as a buffer to keep refugees away from European borders.
Yes.
The funding is literally following the geopolitical anxiety of the donor, not the medical needs of the patient.
Exactly. It is foreign policy masquerading as humanitarianism.
So in the midst of this politically corrupted reconstruction phase, where does the military fit in? Because in places like Afghanistan or Iraq after the initial invasion, the military is often the only organization on the ground with the heavy lift logistics, the engineering battalions, and the sheer budget to actually build things.
Oh, true.
Should the military just bypass the NGOs and build the hospitals themselves?
Interestingly, Surgeon General Lillywhite, a man who spent his career in the military medical establishment, argues strongly, almost vehemently, against this idea.
Really? Why not?
He states clearly that the military should absolutely not be involved in building or running civilian health systems.
If they have the core of engineers and the budget, why not use them to build clinics? Isn't any hospital better than no hospital?
Because it creates entirely unsustainable artificial healthcare systems that collapse the moment the military leaves.
Oh, I see.
Think about the economics of it. If a wealthy foreign military builds a state-of-the-art hospital and staffs it with highly paid foreign doctors and advanced equipment, they instantly undermine the local civilian healthcare providers.
How so?
Local doctors either lose their patients to the free military clinic, or they get hired by the military at salaries the local economy can never match.
Right.
Furthermore, the military sets a standard of care relying on expensive imported drugs and high-tech maintenance that the host nation's Ministry of Health cannot possibly sustain financially once the military inevitably withdraws.
They build a Ferrari in a place that only has the infrastructure to maintain a bicycle. And when the military takes the keys away, the whole thing rusts.
Precisely. And beyond the economics, military-led reconstruction is often completely incoherent with the host nation's long-term health policy.
That makes sense.
And perhaps most dangerously, when armed soldiers are the ones handing out the medicine, it dangerously blurs the lines for neutral NGOs like MSF trying to operate in the same space.
Oh, because of the targeting issue we talked about earlier.
Exactly. If the local population can't tell the difference between a military medic and an NGO doctor, the NGO becomes a target.
Wow. So the military has to purposefully, intentionally hold back its capabilities, even when they could easily build the clinic, to ensure the local system can actually grow and survive long term.
It's a painful paradox for commanders who want to show tangible progress, but a vital restraint for sustainable recovery.
Okay, let's zoom out and look at the absolute mess we've mapped out so far.
There is a mess.
We have civilian hospitals under fire. We have militaries navigating the chaotic legal lotteries of multinational combat care. And we have global geopolitics dictating what gets rebuilt based on the anxieties of rich donor nations. The obvious screaming question is, with all of these competing agendas and absolute chaos, how on earth does the global community figure out if this massive multi-billion-dollar humanitarian system is actually working?
That monumental, arguably impossible task is exactly what the ALNAP State of the Humanitarian System Inception Report attempts to tackle.
Right, the giant blueprint.
Yes. ALNAP is a global network dedicated to improving humanitarian performance, and their 2021 report is a fascinating attempt to impose order on chaos. And they start by making a crucial linguistic and conceptual shift.
What's the shift?
They declare that the global humanitarian apparatus cannot be evaluated like a machine or a corporation. They describe it as a complex adaptive system.
I love that phrase, complex adaptive system. It sounds like something out of evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean in the practice of delivering aid?
It means the system possesses 3 specific, highly frustrating characteristics for anyone trying to measure it.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, it is nonlinear. In a linear system, if you put in $1 of effort, you get $1 of result. The humanitarian system doesn't work that way.
Why not?
Because there are thousands of interacting elements. Hundreds of NGOs, UN agencies, host governments, donor governments, local militias, and the affected communities themselves. It is almost impossible to predict how the system will behave.
So it's completely unpredictable.
Right. Pushing a policy lever in Geneva might cause a completely unexpected, disproportionate reaction in a refugee camp in South Sudan.
Okay, so it's deeply unpredictable. What's the second characteristic?
It is emergent.
Emergent.
Yes. This means the system develops characteristics, behaviors, and cultures as a result of multiple interactions that are entirely more than just the sum of its parts.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. For example, when a massive earthquake hits and 50 different international agencies rush into the same chaotic airport, the resulting coalition response takes on a life and a culture of its own that no single agency planned for or controls. It self-organizes in unpredictable ways.
And the third characteristic?
It is nested.
Nested, like Russian dolls.
Exactly. The humanitarian system isn't a standalone bubble. It is made up of individual organizations, which are themselves complex bureaucratic systems.
Right.
And the entire humanitarian sphere sits within, overlaps with, and is entirely dependent upon larger, vastly more powerful national and international political and economic systems.
So you can't just evaluate the aid in a vacuum.
No, you cannot evaluate a food aid program without evaluating the global commodities market and local warlord taxation simultaneously.
So if you are a researcher at ALNAP, how do you even begin to grade a nonlinear emergent nested system? Where is the rubric? Do they just hand out gold stars?
They rely on a heavily adapted version of the DACE criteria.
The D criteria.
Yes, DACE stands for the Development Assistance Committee, which operates under the OECD. It is essentially the gold standard, internationally recognized framework for evaluating development and humanitarian aid.
What are the actual pillars of this rubric? What are they specifically looking for when they grade an entire global system? Let's break these down, because this seems like the core of how we judge success in saving lives.
ALNAP evaluates the system across several distinct critical pillars. The first is sufficiency and coverage.
Okay, sufficiency and coverage.
This asks the blunt quantitative questions. Was there enough money, food, and medicine in the total global pot?
Right.
And crucially, did that aid actually reach everyone who needed it? Or were marginalized groups like the elderly or ethnic minorities left out of the coverage map?
Okay, so total volume and distribution. What's next?
Relevance and appropriateness.
Ah, we talked about this with the hospital.
Exactly. This is a massive one, and it goes back to our Helmand Province example. Are we giving people what they actually contextually need to survive and recover, or are we just giving them what the donor is comfortable providing?
Did we build the women's hospital they asked for? Or did we dump 1 million smoke detectors on them because it fit our mandate?
Right. It measures the arrogance of the donor against the reality of the victim.
What else?
Then you have effectiveness. Did the intervention actually achieve its stated goals? If the goal of the cholera vaccination campaign was to drop transmission by 50%, did the data show that drop?
Okay, straightforward.
Alongside that is efficiency. Was this a rational, cost-effective use of money and logistics? Did it cost $1,000 to deliver a $10 bag of rice because we used helicopters instead of trucks?
And I imagine they look at the long-term impact as well.
Yes, that is impact. What are the wider, long-term systemic results of the intervention, both positive and negative?
Like unintended consequences.
Exactly. Did our free food aid program save lives this month but completely bankrupt the local farmers, causing a worse famine next year?
Well, wow. Yeah.
And finally, increasingly the most politically charged metric, localization and connectedness.
What does localization mean in this context?
It asks how well the massive international system supported, funded, and empowered local and national responders, rather than just flying in Western expats to overwrite the local infrastructure.
So did the UN partner with the local Red Crescent Society, or did they just push them aside and take over?
Exactly.
Evaluating all of those criteria across a nonlinear, nested global system, I mean, that is a staggering, almost hubristic scope of research. How on earth does ALNAP collect the data to actually answer those questions definitively?
The logistics of the ALNIP research are mind-boggling. At the macro level, they are evaluating massive global financial flows, tracking billions of dollars in official development assistance from governments to agencies.
That alone sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is. They are employing teams to synthesize and cross-reference hundreds of individual internal evaluation reports produced by the various UN agencies and NGOs.
Right.
They are mapping out the total number of international and national staff deployed globally to understand the sheer size of the workforce.
But hold on. If they are just looking at financial flows and reading internal UN reports, aren't they just asking the agencies if they're doing a good job?
Yes.
That feels incredibly biased. Hey, World Food Program, how is the World Food Program doing this year?
Yeah.
We're doing great. Our internal report says we're highly effective. Thanks for asking. It's grading your own homework.
And for decades, that is exactly how humanitarian performance was judged. It was an insular echo chamber of professionals evaluating professionals.
But that's changing.
Yes, the 2021 AL and API report details a massive systemic evolution in how evaluation is taking place. There is a tremendous push across the sector for what they call participatory approaches.
Participatory approach, meaning what?
They are fundamentally shifting the focus of the evaluation away from the headquarters in Geneva and out to the crisis-affected populations themselves.
Meaning they are actually asking the people who survived the earthquake if the aid was any good.
Yeah.
But how do you do that at scale in the middle of a war zone or a famine? You can't exactly send out a SurveyMonkey link to a refugee camp. The logistics of participatory evaluation sound impossible.
It is incredibly difficult, but they are utilizing mobile technology to bridge the gap.
Really? Mobile phones?
Yeah. The ALNP study details a massive data collection effort using SMS text messages and interactive voice response IVR mobile phone surveys.
Wow.
They aim to reach a statistically significant sample of 5,000 aid recipients across 4 to 6 entirely different, highly complex crisis contexts globally.
That is genuinely incredible. What are they actually asking them via text?
They are asking them directly about those DCHAC criteria. Was the aid you received timely? Was it relevant to your family's specific needs? And crucially, they ask about dignity. Were you treated with respect by the aid workers? They are trying to match the cold, bureaucratic DCHAC criteria with the actual lived, subjective experience of the human beings on the receiving end of the system.
I absolutely love the philosophy of this. The idea of asking the recipients directly, of empowering them to essentially review the massive faceless humanitarian system. It restores a sense of agency.
It does.
But I have to push back hard on the practical limitations of this Yelp reviews style of evaluation in the middle of a war zone.
Let's hear the critique.
If you are starving, if your village has been cut off from supply lines, and your family hasn't eaten a full meal in days,
Right.
and a white UN truck finally rolls in and hands you a bag of flour, and then your phone buzzes with an SMS survey asking you to rate the effectiveness of the World Food Program. Aren't you just going to say, yes, the food was good, it was highly relevant, please, for the love of God, send more?
That's a very valid point.
Does a person in the absolute depths of extreme crisis have the vantage point or the luxury to evaluate the macro efficiency of the supply chain? A starving person is going to give a 5-star review to a stale cracker.
That is a very sharp, very valid critique of participatory evaluation. A hungry person evaluating a bag of rice is evaluating their immediate survival. They are not evaluating whether the UN procured that rice at a competitive market rate.
Right.
But ALNAP isn't asking the recipient to evaluate supply chain logistics. They are asking about relevance, timeliness, and dignity.
Yeah.
And those are metrics that only the recipient can truly judge. A logistician in Geneva can tell you that truck arrived on Tuesday. Only the mother in the camp can tell you if Tuesday was fast enough, or if the food on the truck was something her children could digest.
Okay, that is a fair point. They're measuring the human impact, not the spreadsheet. But what about the technology itself?
The mobile phones?
Yeah. Relying on SMS and cell phone surveys in disaster zones, doesn't that inherently structurally risk entirely missing the most vulnerable people in the crisis?
It's a massive risk.
Think about it. The people who don't have cell phones, the people who cannot afford network access, the people who are illiterate and can't read an SMS, or the people who simply don't have the electricity to charge a battery because their grid was bombed.
Yeah, you're describing the most marginalized.
If you use mobile surveys, aren't you only surveying the most privileged layer of victims?
You are hitting on a massive methodological debate, and it is a bias that ALNOP is actively grappling with.
They know it's a problem.
In their methodology report, they explicitly acknowledge the profound demographic access issues inherent in mobile phone surveys. They know they are missing the absolute bottom tier of the vulnerable.
So how do they fix it?
To counter this digital bias, they don't rely solely on phones. They pair the digital surveys with on-the-ground, face-to-face focus groups.
Okay, that makes sense.
And they carefully sample these groups across age, gender, disability, and ethnic identity to try and capture the voices the cell towers miss.
But even so,
But your overarching point stands. In a chaotic, kinetic crisis, the truly marginalized are invariably the hardest to reach with aid, and they are equally the hardest to reach with a survey.
and this brings us to a really uncomfortable realization. Gathering data from people who are living through the absolute worst moments of their lives isn't just a logistical hurdle regarding cell phone batteries.
No, it's not.
It is a profound, deeply complex, ethical minefield. The drive to collect better data sounds great in a boardroom, but what does it look like on the ground?
It looks incredibly messy, and this is where we turn back to The Lancet,
The second commentary.
specifically to their second commentary, which focuses entirely on research ethics and evidence generation in humanitarian health. Because right now, there is a massive push across the sector for evidence-based aid.
Donors want proof.
Exactly. Donors are tired of funding black holes. They demand rigorous scientific proof that their millions of dollars are actually working. And as that donor pressure grows, the pressure on academics and NGOs to conduct research in active disaster zones absolutely skyrockets.
Okay, so you have massive pressure to publish data colliding with a chaotic, unregulated, highly traumatized environment. What happens when that pressure meets that chaos?
You see what the Lancet authors describe as shocking, systemic, recurrent failings in humanitarian research ethics.
What kind of ethical failings are we actually talking about here? Give me the reality of what researchers are doing wrong.
We are talking about deeply exploitative research practices. For example, conducting studies on disaster survivors that are completely unnecessary or entirely duplicative of research that has already been done.
Why would they do that?
Simply because an academic researcher wanted to publish a paper and advance their career using a captive, traumatized population as a convenient data set.
Treating refugees like lab rats for a thesis.
Exactly, or it gets more invasive. The authors detail instances of researchers collecting biological samples, like drawing blood, taking saliva swabs, or collecting tissue from populations in the midst of chaos.
Without asking.
Without securing properly local approval, and without the participants having any real understanding of how those genetic samples might be stored, shared, or commercialized in the future.
That feels incredibly predatory. It's essentially biocolonialism disguised as emergency response.
It can absolutely function that way, but the ethical breaches aren't just physical, they are psychological.
How so?
The commentary highlights the profound damage done when researchers helicopter into a camp to investigate deeply sensitive, traumatic issues, like interviewing survivors about sexual violence and conflict, or mapping rates of severe PTSD.
Which is important data to have to direct resources, right?
It is vital data. But the ethical failure occurs when the researchers extract those agonizing stories, force the survivor to relive their trauma for a data point, and then pack up their clipboards and leave.
Without helping them.
Without having any mechanisms, funding, or clinical pathways in place to care for that participant's mental well-being afterward. They extract the trauma, secure the grant money, and leave the human being completely shattered.
Okay, let's really unpack this tension. Because we are looking at two massively competing moral imperatives here.
We really are.
On one hand, as the ALNP report just showed us, we have a profound ethical imperative to collect good, rigorous data. If we don't know what works, we continue to waste billions of dollars on useless aid, like the smoke detectors in Helmand, while people literally die.
Mm-hmm.
Good data saves lives.
Yes.
But on the other hand, the traditional mechanisms we use to ensure research is ethical, the institutional review boards, or IRBs, at major universities, they are notoriously painfully slow.
They are glacial. The traditional ethics governance structure was built for a highly controlled, multi-year clinical trial happening in a pristine hospital in Boston or London.
Right.
It is bureaucratic, risk-averse, and completely detached from the reality of a crisis.
Right. If a massive 8.0 earthquake hits Port-au-Prince or a novel hemorrhagic fever breaks out in the Congo, researchers on the ground don't have 6 months to wait for an ethics committee in a university boardroom to debate the wording of their survey questions.
The crisis is shifting daily. The data is needed tomorrow to stop the outbreak.
So how do you solve that? You can't just throw out the rule book and abandon ethics entirely because you're in a hurry, but you also can't wait 6 months for a stamp of approval while people die.
Exactly.
What is the actual solution proposed in The Lancet?
The authors argue that research ethics in humanitarian settings must undergo a fundamental paradigm shift. We must move beyond viewing ethics as simply a bureaucratic hurdle.
Just getting a piece of paper signed for approval before you deploy.
Right. Ethics in a war zone has to be about the actual, active, continuous protection of the people being researched.
What does active protection look like for a researcher in the field?
It requires researchers to be deeply trained in real-time ethical decision-making. They must have the authority and the competence to adapt their protocols to unanticipated ethical issues as they arise in the mud and the chaos.
Rather than sticking to the approved plan.
Exactly. Rather than rigidly adhering to a static protocol approved by committee months ago. It means building ethical oversight into the daily operations of the field team, not just treating it as a prerequisite checklist.
I hear that, and it sounds like a necessary evolution. But I want to pose a really tough, fundamental moral question here regarding the very concept of gathering data in a crisis.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's strip away the bureaucracy and look at the human interaction. Imagine you are a refugee. You have just fled a brutal civil war. You have lost your home, your livelihood, your community, and maybe members of your own family.
A position of absolute, total vulnerability.
Yes. You are currently sitting in a sweltering tent in a camp, entirely dependent on foreign aid for your next meal.
Right?
And then a Western researcher wearing a high-visibility UN vest, holding a clipboard, flanked by security, walks into your tent and asks if you would consent to being part of a medical study.
I see where you're going with this.
The power dynamic between those two human beings is not just imbalanced, it is astronomical.
The disparity in power, resources, and agency is as wide as it gets in human interaction.
So my question is, how can the legal and moral concept of informed consent even exist in that tent?
It's incredibly difficult.
When one person holds all the resources,
Yes.
the food, the water, the medicine, the visas, and the other person is desperately fighting for basic survival, if that refugee thinks that answering your survey or giving you a vial of blood will increase their chances of getting an extra blanket or a ration card, they will answer whatever you want.
Yes, they will.
They will sign whatever form you put in front of them. Isn't all data collected in the epicenter of a crisis inherently coercive?
You are articulating perhaps the single most difficult, unresolved question in all of humanitarian research. The uncomfortable truth is that true, uncoerced, perfectly autonomous informed consent in a raw survival situation may be practically impossible.
So it is coercive.
When your physical survival is on the line, your autonomy is inherently compromised by your desperation.
So what do we do? Just stop doing research and fly blind?
No, because flying blind kills people too. This impossible tension is exactly why the Lancet authors argue that the focus of ethical review must shift fundamentally.
How so?
We have to stop obsessing over the legalistic question of, did the refugee sign the consent form without coercion? And start relentlessly asking the moral question. Is this specific research project actively protecting and directly benefiting this specific community right now? If the research is just for a journal article next year and doesn't directly contribute to improving the humanitarian response for the people in that camp today, it simply should not be done.
That makes a lot of sense.
The burden of ethical justification is vastly, exponentially higher when the population you are studying is entirely stripped of their power. You aren't just collecting data, you are holding their dignity in your hands.
Wow. So what does this all mean? If you stayed with us through this hour, we've gone on an incredibly dense, often uncomfortable journey today.
We really have.
We started by looking at the brutal, visceral reality of hospitals under fire, unpacking how the age-old concept of the medical safe haven is actively being eroded, and how healing itself is now viewed as an act of rebellion.
We then navigated the high-tech, deeply impressive, yet completely chaotic world of multinational military medicine.
Right.
We saw how domestic political tolerance for casualties drives incredible medical innovation, but also creates a landscape where a soldier's survival might depend on the terrifying legal lottery of which Allied helicopter happens to pick them up.
From there, we uncovered the cynical geopolitical chess game of Reconstruction funding.
Yeah, that was bleak.
We saw how the anxieties and media cycles of rich donor nations consistently override the desperately stated needs of local populations, choosing to build walls against Ebola rather than the women's hospital Hellman begged for.
And finally, we looked at the immense, almost paralyzing logistical and ethical nightmares of trying to evaluate this entire messy system.
Right, grading a nonlinear global apparatus.
And exploring the profound moral hazard of trying to extract clean data from human beings in the midst of absolute chaos.
If there is one overarching thesis to take away from this deep dive, it's that humanitarian aid is never, ever just the simple act of giving things to people.
Never.
It is a complex, adaptive, highly politicized, and increasingly dangerous global ecosystem.
And that is exactly how you should view the world moving forward.
Absolutely.
If you are listening to this on your commute or washing dishes, the next time you look at your phone and see a news headline about a massive earthquake response, a military medical deployment, or a terrifying new outbreak, I hope you won't just see the white trucks and the medical
And
tent.
I hope you will see the massive, invisible machinery operating furiously behind the scenes.
You'll think about the donor politics dictating the supplies on those trucks, the intense coalition compromises happening inside those field hospitals, and the flawed but necessary evaluation frameworks trying to make sense of the chaos.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final, lingering question to ponder on your own. It's something that has been bothering me since I finished reading these sources.
What's that?
Throughout this deep dive, we've seen how military health systems and civilian NGO health systems are desperately, almost violently trying to stay in their own lanes.
Right. The military treats its soldiers and tries not to build civilian hospitals. NGOs like MSF treat civilians, refuse military escorts, and fiercely guard their neutrality.
It is a fragile separation, but
Mhm.
one that both sides view as absolutely necessary for their survival and mandate.
Exactly.
But look at the trajectory of the world. As modern mega-crises increasingly blend armed conflict with unprecedented climate disasters, massive human migration, and global pandemics, and as international funding becomes tighter and donor fatigue sets in, will those artificial boundaries of the humanitarian system eventually collapse entirely?
Given the scale of future crises, it is a very real, very pressing possibility.
Think about it. If a climate-driven conflict creates 10 million refugees overnight, and the military is literally the only entity left on the planet with the budget, the aircraft, and the heavy-lift logistics to respond to a mega-crisis of that scale, what happens to the core principle of humanitarian neutrality?
Will NGOs be forced to permanently embed with militaries just to survive?
We started this deep dive by talking about the precision of an X-ray. In the humanitarian world today, the bones of the system are broken, the diagnostic image is incredibly blurry, and the X-ray machine itself is taking sniper fire.
But despite the murky, deeply flawed landscape, the attempt to heal, the rebellion of saving a life, must continue.
Even when the diagnosis is chaos. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the simple narratives, keep looking for the invisible machinery, and as always, keep asking the hard questions.